Listening ad-free on Amazon Music.
One afternoon in mid-July 2014, 59-year-old Jack Parks and his fiancée, Carol LaPaya, walked through their neighborhood of Kennedy Township, Pennsylvania. Jack sported a black fedora, wire-frame glasses, and a lopsided grin beneath a graying mustache. Carol hung on his arm, smiling at how her engagement ring sparkled in the sunlight. As they walked, they passed by several neighbors who were outside doing yard work or talking. Jack and Carol waved to each person as they passed, and everyone waved back. Their neighborhood was a close-knit, working-class community 10 miles outside of Pittsburgh, and everybody seemed to know each other. In fact, Jack even had family on this street. One of his nephews, Bradley Johnson, lived nearby. As Jack and Carol passed by Bradley's house, Jack slowed down, trying to see if Bradley was home. His nephew had mentioned wanting to talk to him in person about something serious and urgent, but Jack could see that the house was empty, so that conversation would have to wait. Which was fine, because today, Jack and Carol were on a mission. Inside of Carol's purse was a large stack of wedding invitations, and they were on their way to drop these invitations in the mail, which was huge for them, because their wedding had been an unusually long time coming. So Jack and Carol had met at a bar 25 years ago. They'd fallen for each other quickly, but Jack had dragged his feet on proposing. And then, when he had felt ready, Carol was swamped at work. Then Jack was busy. The timing was just always bad, and the longer they put marriage off, the less important it seemed. And anyways, they were in love and totally committed to each other. They didn't need a marriage license to prove that. But last February, Jack's mother had passed away. Her death had made him realize that he wasn't getting any younger, and he really wanted to marry the woman he'd loved for decades. So, a few months ago, he'd finally proposed. And ever since, their days had been consumed with wedding preparations. They had the venue, the dress, and the rings, and now it was finally time to send out the invitations. The couple came to the end of the block and stopped in front of the mailbox. Carol took the envelopes from her purse and then joked that this was their last chance to cross anyone off their invite list. Jack just laughed and said they were not cutting anyone. So Carol pushed the envelopes through the mailbox slot until only one invitation remained. Carol hesitated for a second, looking at the name on that last envelope. It was her nephew, a 22-year-old named Michael LaPaya. She and Jack had been angry at Michael this whole past year. Their broken relationship with him was a sore spot for both of them. So Jack and Carol did not have children of their own, but they'd always doted on their nieces and nephews. When the kids were younger, Jack and Carol would have them over for slumber parties where they'd stay up late watching movies and eating popcorn, and as the kids got older, they'd all stayed close. Except for Michael. A few years back, Michael had started drifting away from Jack and Carol and the rest of the family, and getting into lots of trouble. He joined the army, but gotten dishonorably discharged for marijuana possession, and ever since, he'd suffered from PTSD and began experimenting with harder drugs. But that was actually not what caused the rift. Jack and Carol had supported Michael, even through his struggles, until one day the previous September. During a Labor Day party that Jack and Carol had hosted, guests had seen Michael go into the couple's bedroom. And when the party was over, Carol had discovered that her expensive jewelry was missing. Jack and Carol had confronted Michael, who denied taking anything, but they hadn't believed him. They told him he was no longer welcome in their home, and things had been extremely tense between them ever since. But now, Jack and Carol were ready to make amends by inviting Michael to their wedding. So, standing on the sidewalk, Carol took a deep breath and then dropped Michael's invitation into the mailbox. And suddenly, both Jack and Carol felt a whole lot lighter. The invitations were out, and good things were ahead. Jack and Carol turned away from the mailbox and began heading back home. As they reached their driveway, Jack waved to a few men standing directly across the street, outside of a small factory called Silver Star Meats. The workers were outside in their aprons smoking, and they waved back. Jack was about to go over and talk to them when he noticed Carol's irritated expression, and so he thought better of it. Jack liked the guys from the factory, but he knew they made Carol uncomfortable. She hated that they took their smoke breaks so close to their house, and she thought their blood-stained aprons were kind of unsettling. So Jack just turned away, and then he and Carol walked up their porch steps and into their house. A few days later, on Monday, July 21st, Carol sat at her desk at work, reviewing her to-do list for the wedding. The ceremony was just 6 weeks away, and there was still a lot to figure out. But then, at 10:45 a.m., her cell phone rang. And to her surprise, it was Jack's realtor. Jack had hired this realtor to sell his mother's house after she had died, and now the realtor said some potential buyers wanted to see the house that afternoon. She wanted Jack and Carol to meet her there at 4 p.m. This was all good news, because Carol and Jack had been eager to sell that house as quickly as possible. But before hanging up, Carol asked why the realtor called her instead of calling Jack. The realtor said they did call Jack first. He just didn't answer. This seemed odd to Carol. As soon as she hung up, she tried Jack's cell phone, and it rang several times before going to voicemail. She left him a message, then hung up and called the house. And as it rang, she expected to hear Jack's voice any second, but again, the call went to voicemail. Carol just sat there, trying to ignore the sick feeling of dread in her stomach. Jack knew what a worrier she could be, so he always answered her calls. But she told herself that maybe he was in the shower, or maybe outside mowing the grass without his phone on him. He would probably call her back any minute. But the clock kept ticking, and by noon, Jack still had not called. And so Carol tried him again, but he still didn't answer. Frustrated, she dropped her phone back in her purse and just focused on her computer, trying to ignore her mounting anxiety. But by 2:30 p.m., when still Jack had not called, so now it's been 3.5 hours since that first missed call, Carol just couldn't take it anymore. So she left work and began heading straight home. 20 minutes later, Carol pulled up outside of her and Jack's house. And right away, she saw that the garage door was open and Jack's car was inside, which meant he had to be home. Carol felt relieved. She was sure Jack would explain why he had missed her calls, and better yet, they'd still be able to make their 4 p.m. appointment with their realtor. But as Carol got out of her car and started up the walkway, she saw something that made her stomach drop all over again. So Jack and Carol's front porch was enclosed by a gate, and both Jack and Carol always kept the gate closed because their dog was a runner, and they wanted to make sure he didn't get out. But now Carol saw the gate was wide open. Carol rushed through the gate to the front door and turned the knob. But even though the doorknob turned, meaning it was unlocked, the door didn't budge when she pushed on it. That's when Carol realized the deadbolt inside, which they never used, must be locked. And now her anxiety turned to actual fear. Between the deadbolt, the open gate, and Jack not answering his phone, she was certain something had to be wrong here. Carol's hands shook as she dug through her purse for the house key, then struggled to get it into the lock. Finally she did, the deadbolt turned, and the door swung open. Carol stepped inside with her heart pounding, but the house was silent and still. She took a few steps further in, and then her eyes suddenly fell on something under the coffee table inside of the living room. For a second, her brain couldn't even compute what she was looking at. But then, when it clicked, she let out a scream. Because underneath the coffee table was Jack. He was lying face down on the carpet with a pool of blood under his head. Carol rushed over to Jack and shook him, but he didn't move or make a sound. And so in a panic, she found her phone and dialed 911. When the dispatcher picked up, Carol shouted that there'd been some kind of horrible accident. Her fiancé must have fallen and hit his head on the coffee table. And she begged the dispatcher to please send help now. Moments later, police and first responders arrived, and they had to physically drag Carol away from Jack's side. Carol watched as they knelt beside her fiancé and checked for a pulse, but they didn't find one. Carol's world crumbled. She knew Jack was dead. A short while later, Detective Lori McKeel of the Allegheny County Homicide Unit arrived on the scene. A perimeter was already established, and the house was crawling with police. But before McKeel went in, she looked around outside. Neighbors were watching the activity from their front lawns, and McKeel noticed a specific group of people huddled together on the sidewalk, consoling a sobbing woman whose hands were covered in blood. McKeel guessed this must be the victim's partner, and the people around her were her family. But before speaking to her, the detective quickly made her way across the yard and went inside of the house. Inside, officers and forensic techs searched the front room for evidence. McKeel had already been briefed on this case, so she knew the victim's name was Jack Parks, and his fiancée had found him dead after an apparent fall. McKeel went into the living room, where Jack's body lay face up, partially underneath the coffee table. There was a lot of blood, and at first glance, a fall didn't seem out of the question. However, when she crouched down to get a better look, she found a small hole behind Jack's right ear, toward the back of his skull. It was a gunshot wound, which meant this was no accidental fall. This was a murder. McKeel stood up and told the other investigators nearby to keep their eyes peeled for bullet casings or a gun. Then she continued scanning the house. The house was lived in, but relatively neat, with boxes of what looked like wedding favors stacked in the hall. But when McKeel stepped inside of the master bedroom, she saw this room had been totally ransacked. Dressers were overturned and drawers were pulled out. Several jewelry boxes lay empty and discarded on the carpet. Either this was a robbery, or someone had staged the scene to make it look like one. As McKeel made her way back to the living room, she saw several photos of what looked like a seemingly loving couple about to get married. But McKeel's training told her not to take anything at face value. Every relationship had its problems, and a deadline like a wedding could bring tension to the surface. So before McKeel did anything else, she wanted to speak to Jack's fiancé. If there were any skeletons in the couple's closet, she needed to know about them. Later that afternoon, Detective McKeel sat with Carol in an interview room at the police station. McKeel knew that so far, nobody had told Carol much of anything, including the fact that Jack's death was a murder, not an accidental fall. And from McKeel's point of view, this was a good thing. The romantic partner was always the primary suspect in a murder. And so McKeel wanted to study how Carol behaved in their interview before she told Carol anything about the investigation. So McKeel started slowly, asking basic questions about Carol's relationship with Jack. But as Carol calmed down and opened up, McKeel began to probe deeper. She asked if either Carol or Jack was getting cold feet about their wedding, and why did it take them so long to get engaged? Were there suspicions of infidelity? What about money problems? McKeel watched Carol for any hint of defensiveness or anger. But while Carol did deny having any problems with Jack, she didn't seem mad at being asked about it. She just seemed confused. So, McKeel decided to ask a question that she knew would increase the pressure, by making it obvious that Carol was now a suspect in a murder. The detective looked into Carol's eyes and asked her if she owned a gun. And at this, Carol froze. After a second, she asked why she was being questioned about a gun when her fiancé had fallen. McKeel stayed quiet and watched as Carol's expression changed from confusion to understanding. Carol just looked at McKeel and said, "Are you saying Jack was shot?" And then Carol just began sobbing. Even though McKeel could not officially rule Carol out as a suspect yet, she did think Carol's reaction to this was very genuine. So McKeel handed Carol a box of tissues and asked in a gentle voice if Jack had any enemies. Through tears, Carol said no. In fact, if anything, Jack was sometimes too friendly. Recently, Carol said she'd come home to find Jack hanging out in the living room with one of the workers from the factory across the street. Carol said she'd been mad at him for letting a stranger inside of their home. And then after that, Carol just broke into more sobs. McKeel narrowed her eyes as she thought back to Jack and Carol's ransacked bedroom. Crime scene techs were still processing the scene, but it had looked like theft was at least part of the motive. So if Jack really had no enemies and his murder was not personal, then this being a robbery by a stranger, like a factory worker, was a definite possibility. McKeel knew that if Jack and Carol's home really had been robbed during this murder, then whoever did the robbery would likely try to unload the stolen goods quickly. And the easiest way to do that was to sell them to a local pawn shop. So, the day after Jack's murder, McKeel got a list of the items missing from Jack and Carol's home, which included several expensive watches, rings, and other pieces of jewelry, and contacted every pawnshop in the immediate area. But none of them claimed to have any of the missing jewelry yet, so McKeel left descriptions of the items along with her number. McKeel also contacted the City of Pittsburgh Pawn Division, which kept an extensive database of pawned items, and gave them descriptions of the stolen jewelry as well. It was sort of like she was fishing, and so McKeel knew she had to be patient. So, while she waited to hear back, she began looking into the workers from the Silver Star Meats Factory. Within a few days of the murder, McKeel led a team of officers to that factory. And as soon as she stepped out of her car, she could see that anybody standing right outside of the factory would have a clear view of Jack and Carol's front door and garage. From speaking to Carol, she knew Jack had been friendly with several factory employees, and on at least one occasion had invited them into his home. And so those types of visits would have been perfect opportunities to learn the layout of Jack and Carol's house and to figure out where they kept their valuables. Once inside the factory, McKeel and her officers began interviewing close to 40 workers, one by one. And pretty quickly, they identified the man who'd been invited by Jack into their home. His name was Ronald Blevins, and he had a criminal history of petty theft and assault. To McKeel, this was promising. But Blevins had not been at work on the day of Jack's murder because he was on a scheduled vacation. Now, McKeel did not think this made him any less of a suspect, but this early in the case, there wasn't any physical evidence to connect him to the crime, so she couldn't arrest him. As McKeel and her team left the meat factory, she felt a bit deflated. She really needed the forensics to come back if she was going to make any real progress on this case. Fortunately, though, there would be new evidence for her waiting back at the station. A copy of Jack's autopsy report was sitting on McKeel's desk. She opened it and began reading. And right away, she saw something important. Other than the gunshot wound, there were no bruises or scratches found anywhere on Jack's body. There was no sign of a struggle at all. And so McKeel knew this could mean that the killer broke into the house and then surprised Jack and shot him from behind, or it could mean Jack knew his killer and had let this person inside of his house. McKeel kept on reading the report, and as she got towards the end of it, her eyes went wide. The coroner had made a major discovery. A bullet had been extracted from Jack's skull, and they determined it came from a .380 caliber handgun. This was extremely helpful. McKeel still did not have the actual murder weapon, but now she knew what kind of gun she was looking for. And so she wanted to find out if somebody close to Jack, someone let's say he would have welcomed into his home, owned a gun like that. Over the next few days, Detective McKeel interviewed Jack's friends and family, and most of them echoed Carol's comments that Jack got along with everybody. And no one McKeel met with claimed to own a .380 caliber handgun. And so McKeel felt like she was quickly running into yet another dead end. That was until a few people mentioned a fight Jack had had with Carol's nephew at a Labor Day party. And also folks mentioned that one of Jack's nephews, so a different nephew, was looking to hash out a serious and urgent matter with his uncle in the days right before the murder. The people who mentioned those two nephews said that the nephews had been really close with Jack for most of their lives. But McKeel knew those relationships could have turned bad as soon as jewelry or money got involved. So she went to interview both men immediately. The first house she went to belonged to Carol's nephew, Michael Lapaya, the Army veteran who Jack and Carol had accused of stealing at their Labor Day party. When she began questioning Michael, he didn't deny that he and his uncle had a falling out. But he also insisted Jack was wrong about him stealing. More importantly, though, Michael denied having anything to do with Jack's death. He said he'd been busy on the day of the murder, at a doctor's appointment to treat his PTSD, and then he had also gone shopping with his girlfriend. And he showed McKeel receipts to prove it. And also, Michael did admit that he had lots of guns, and he knew how to use them after his time in the military. However, the one gun he didn't own was a .380 caliber handgun. After the interview, McKeel contacted the Veterans Affairs Medical Center and confirmed that Michael attended his appointment on the day of the murder. She was also able to verify that charges had been made on his credit card in a different city around the time of Jack's death. All in all, Michael's alibi seemed solid. So, Detective McKeel headed back to Jack and Carol's neighborhood to meet with the second nephew that Jack's friends and family had mentioned. This was Jack's nephew, Bradley, the one who lived on the same street and had been apparently wanting to speak with Jack in person about something serious and urgent. Now, from what other people had already told her, McKeel knew Bradley was mad at Jack for selling his mother's house, because Bradley thought the property should stay in the family. She also knew Bradley and Carol didn't really get along. To McKeel, this sounded like a pretty deep-rooted dispute, and she expected Bradley to be cagey when they spoke about it. However, once they sat down at Bradley's kitchen table, what Bradley actually said blew McKeel away. Right off the bat, Bradley said that at 10:30 a.m. on July 21st, which was the day of the murder, he'd waited until Carol had left for work and then walked over to Jack's house to confront him. Bradley said once Jack let him inside, he'd immediately asked Jack to halt the sale of his grandmother's house. Bradley was struggling financially and wanted to move into his grandmother's house with his girlfriend to save money. Bradley said Jack seemed open to the idea, but he refused to make a decision right then because he wanted to speak to Carol first. And at that point, Bradley knew he was not going to get the house, because he knew Carol would not like the idea and she would convince Jack to keep trying to sell the house. So Bradley told McKeel he'd just given up and left Jack's house sometime around 11:15 a.m., a little more than 3 hours before Carol would arrive home and find Jack dead. As Bradley finished up the story, McKeel was stunned silent. Bradley had just openly confessed to being inside of Jack's home alone with him on the day Jack died. And also, Bradley admitted that he had been there arguing over a property worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But amazingly, Bradley still wasn't done with his story. Just as McKeel was about to leave, he casually revealed one more fact. He told her that he did in fact own a .380 caliber handgun. McKeel confiscated Bradley's gun, then raced back to the station to have it analyzed by the ballistics lab to see if it was the murder weapon. It would take a while for the results to come in, but McKeel barely had to wait before she got another huge break in the case. That day, a member of McKeel's team told her he'd finally received a call back from a pawnshop owner in a nearby town. According to that owner, a young couple had come into their shop on July 21st, the day of Jack's murder. And this couple had wanted to sell a bunch of jewelry, including gold chains and rings. And the owner noticed that several of these pieces had been smashed and mangled, which made the owner suspect that these could be stolen. And so as a result, he had not purchased these pieces of jewelry, but he'd convinced the couple to let him take a few photos of the jewelry, and then after the couple left, he contacted the police in the area. And it had taken 3 days for those police to connect the incident to Jack's case and then get in touch with McKeel's team. But as soon as McKeel got this news, she went straight to the pawn shop to review the photos of the potentially stolen items. And when she saw these photos, there was no doubt that was Jack's jewelry. Now, this pawn shop did not have a security camera, so there was no footage of the couple who tried to sell Jack's stuff. But McKeel showed the pawn shop owner some photos of local criminals along with dozens of people of interest in Jack's murder case, which included Jack's nephew Bradley. And as these pictures were being shown, the owner suddenly stopped McKeel and pointed out one person in particular and said, "Yep, that's the man I saw." And to McKeel's surprise, it was not Bradley. The man the pawnshop owner picked out was named Brian Gibbons. He had a record of theft, and the police knew of him, but they hadn't remotely considered him as a suspect in Jack's murder because Brian had no known connections to Jack. But now, armed with this new information, McKeel left the pawn shop and headed to Brian's house. And as soon as Brian saw her, McKeel could tell she'd taken him by surprise. Brian denied having any knowledge of the murder, but when McKeel looked in his bedroom, It was absolutely littered with purses and jewelry. None of the items belonged to Jack or Carol, but a lot of the stuff had been reported stolen. This meant McKeel could charge Brian and hold him in custody while she looked for a connection to Jack's case. And so that's what McKeel did. She arrested Brian for theft. However, she still wasn't totally sure if he'd actually played a role in Jack's murder. McKeel had basically convinced herself that Jack's nephew, Bradley, was the killer. But now, Brian had come out of left field, and he seemed like an equally strong suspect. And so McKeel wondered if maybe these two men had worked together, with Bradley actually committing the crime and then passing off the jewelry to Brian to sell. But McKeel had no evidence that these two men even knew each other. And until the ballistics results came back, she didn't even know if Bradley's gun was the murder weapon. It was like suddenly McKeel had gone from having a case full of dead ends to having a case with too many good suspects. It would take another week before the final piece of evidence fell into place. On August 4th, 2 weeks after Jack's death, McKeel got a call about a second pawn shop, where a young man had stopped in the day after the murder trying to sell a bunch of damaged jewelry. Unlike at the first pawn shop, the employee at this one had not realized the jewelry was stolen, so he had bought it. Police had already examined the jewelry and confirmed it belonged to Jack. But the most important thing about this pawn shop was that it did have a security camera. And when McKeel watched that footage, she knew who killed Jack. Based on that surveillance footage, evidence collected at the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Jack Parks on the morning of July 21st, 2014. That morning, the killer woke up in agony. They lay in bed for several minutes, drenched in sweat. Their cramps were getting worse. And beneath the pain, a horrible, clawing hunger was growing, demanding to be fed. From the next room, their partner shouted that they were heading off to work. At this, the killer scrambled up, yelling for their partner to wait. The killer dragged themselves out of bed and stumbled from the room. With a wild look on their face, they told their partner to call in sick today. They were going for a ride. A short while later, at about noon, the couple pulled up to the curb 1 block from the Silver Star Meats factory. The killer eyed the house directly across from the factory. The garage was open, and Jack's car was inside. He was home. The killer reached inside the glove box and took out a .380 caliber handgun. They told their partner to drive away if they weren't back in 30 minutes. Then they pocketed the gun, pulled the hood of their sweatshirt over their head, and got out of the car. The killer's heart pounded as they hurried down the sidewalk, avoiding eye contact with the meat factory employees, just standing about in their blood-stained aprons. The killer reached Jack's house, headed up the walkway, went through the front gate, and right to the door. They knocked and then waited. When no one answered, they urgently knocked again. The door opened. Jack looked out and quickly waved the killer inside. Jack turned away from the door and asked the killer if he could get them something to drink. But the killer didn't answer. Instead, they followed Jack through the doorway and into the front room, and there, they stopped, drew the gun from their pocket, raised the barrel just inches from Jack's right ear, and fired. The bullet struck Jack in the back of the head. He fell, dead before he even touched the ground. And immediately, the killer bolted upstairs to the master bedroom, where they tore through the dresser, ripping out drawers and dumping the contents all over the floor. It didn't take long to find what they were looking for. They quickly dug through the room and found Carol's jewelry box and Jack's rings, chains, and watches. The killer stuck the items into the pockets of their sweatshirt, feeling a thrill of victory. Soon, that gnawing hunger would be satisfied. The pain would end. Then, the phone in the house began to ring, and the killer just froze. The killer listened as the call went to voicemail. Carol's voice echoed from the machine, asking why Jack wasn't picking up his cell phone, telling him that somebody was interested in buying his mother's house, and they needed to get there by 4 p.m. to open it up. Then Carol said she loved him and hung up. As soon as the voicemail ended, the the killer rushed back downstairs to the front door. They grabbed the key off an end table to lock the deadbolt, but then something caught their eye. And once again, they froze. The killer saw Jack's feet jutting out from behind the coffee table. Beyond that, the killer saw the whole living room. It was a place with a lot of happy memories, where they, the killer, had spent countless slumber parties eating popcorn and watching movies with their cousins. A lump began to form in the killer's throat as they looked at a particular photo on the wall. Their 10-year-old self was smiling right back at them. The killer looked down at the floor, said goodbye to their Uncle Jack, and left. Jack's nephew, Bradley Johnson, had been high on Detective McKeel's suspect list. But when the results of the ballistics test on Bradley's .380 caliber handgun came back, it did not match the murder weapon. Also, at that second pawn shop where they had surveillance footage, it was not Bradley who McKeel saw, because Bradley didn't kill his uncle. Carol's nephew, the disgraced Army veteran Michael Lapaya, did. It would turn out Michael had been really struggling since his dishonorable discharge from the Army, even worse than some of his family knew. He'd started using heroin and begun stealing to support the habit. And as his addiction worsened, Michael became increasingly desperate for cash. And in July 2014, he saw a quick way to get it, by killing Uncle Jack and stealing his jewelry. Jewelry Michael pawned the next day for just a little over $1,000. Once Detective McKeel saw Michael on that pawn shop surveillance footage, she was sure she'd found Jack's killer. And soon after that, she dug into Michael's phone records and discovered that his phone had pinged off a cell phone tower near Jack's house around the time of the murder, not long before Michael had gone shopping with his girlfriend and to his medical appointment just to give himself an alibi. Eventually, Michael would confess to what he'd done. Michael was convicted of first-degree murder and received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. His girlfriend and alleged getaway driver was never charged. As for Brian Gibbons, the jewelry thief who Detective McKeel thought could be connected to this case, he was ultimately cleared of any involvement. The pawnshop owner who identified him had simply made a mistake. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.
Every year, hundreds of people go missing inside of national parks all over North America. But of those hundreds of people every year, a few of them go missing under very strange circumstances. And a man named David Politis, who's a former police detective, has made it his mission to look into just the bizarre disappearances that are occurring all over North America in his series that's called Missing 411. So there are thousands of these strange cases inside of Missing 411 that David Politis has poured tens of thousands of hours of research into. And he puts them into books, into documentaries. And so there's really no shortage of strange cases to look at. But as I begin my own research into Missing 411 and learn about these different cases, I have been pulling groups of stories that stand out to me as being particularly interesting or just fascinating or just strange. And I'm making videos to highlight those stories. And so I've already done one video like this where I highlighted 5 stories that I thought were particularly strange. You can find that in the description. I left a link to that video if you want to check that out. And so today I'm going to be looking at another 5 cases from the Missing 411 project that are just totally weird. But before we get into today's stories, if you're interested in the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you've come to the right channel, because I post 3 to 4 times a week all about the strange, dark, and mysterious, like I'm promising to deliver today. And if that's your deal, I would ask you to please gently uppercut the like button and then also subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of those 3 to 4 weekly uploads. All right, let's get into the story. So this first one really takes the cake for just being strange. You have a family that basically has two experiences that are somewhat connected. You're gonna have to be the judge if they're connected or not, but very strange. On October 1st of 2010, this family, who decided to remain anonymous for the missing 411 story, they go camping, and it's a 3.5-year-old boy, his older sister, and then the mom and the dad. And so they go camping at Mount Shasta in California, which is a popular camping site. And the family loved to go camping there. And so they're all sitting around the campfire, kind of hanging out at the campsite. It's getting late in the evening, maybe 5, 6 o'clock. And the sister would say that she was looking at her brother, turned away for a second, and then looked back, and he was gone. And it was so sudden that she actually went to go look for him and couldn't find him. So she went and told her mom and her dad, and they start calling for their son, and they're looking all over their campsite, and he's gone. Authorities show up, and they launch a full search. And for 5 hours, they have hundreds of people scouring this area, not only the campsite, but the surrounding areas, and there's no trace of this boy. 5 hours later, they find him laying in a thicket on a trail that had been searched multiple times. And it wasn't like hidden. The thicket was like right by the side of the trail. So if you've searched this trail, you've found this kid. So meaning he couldn't have been there during the search. He must have arrived and then they found him on this trail. Everybody was so happy that they found this kid and he wasn't physically harmed that no one really looked into the fact that it doesn't make any sense that he is here. How did he get here? Where did he go? Where has he been? No one thought about that. They were like, we got the kid back. We're all happy. The parents are happy. Everyone's ready to just move on. And so the kid goes to the hospital. The doctor looks at the kid and says, you know what, he's fine. This is obviously a traumatic situation, but he's fine. You can take him home. And so the kid goes home with his parents, and pretty quickly the family went back to normal. They were obviously super grateful that they didn't lose their son. About 3 weeks after this whole ordeal, the boy is with his grandmother, who he called Cappy, and he looks at Cappy and he goes, I don't like the other Cappy. And so his grandmother, the real Cappy, she looks at him and she was like, what do you mean? Now, remember, this is a 3.5-year-old boy. Language skills, not the best, okay? But this story that he tells his grandmother, he had previously told his father, but the father had written it off as the ramblings of a 3.5-year-old. It wasn't until the grandmother told the father about the story that he was like, I've heard that story. And so the boy says, you know, while he was camping, he turned and he saw Cappy waving to him to come with him. And so he loves Cappy and he goes with Cappy, and Cappy leads him up a hill to a cave. Now the whole time, the real Cappy, who wasn't there, she was not with them camping. She's thinking, oh my God, someone who looks like me abducted this child. So she's listening, horrified. He said, you know, she brought me up to a cave. And when we got into the cave, he said there were spiders and purses, like women's purses. And he turned to look at Cappy, and he said that her head was glowing. And it was when he realized this is not Cappy. This is the other Cappy. And he said the other Cappy kept asking him questions, but he didn't know the answers. And so the other Cappy got frustrated and told him to leave and pushed him out of the cave. And he said that he left the cave and wound up in the thicket, and that's when he was found. And so when Cappy goes and tells the father, and the father says, I've heard that story, they're like, that's so weird. Do you think there's any truth to this? Is there someone that looked like me, Cappy, that took the boy away? And so as Cappy and the boy's father are talking, Cappy feels compelled to share her own strange story about being on Mount Shasta. Because prior to this, the family, I think the way they were looking at what happened is the boy wandered off and he returned 5 hours later. But with the boy's story being kind of corroborated by, you know, the father who heard the same story, Cappy's like, I got to share my story now because I don't know if it's connected, but I had a very strange experience on Mount Shasta as well a year ago. You know, she went camping a year earlier with her friend, and they go to a campsite on Mount Shasta, the same place where the boy disappeared, and apparently saw the other Cappy. And so Cappy says that night they're sitting around the campfire and it's dark, and she notices a set of eyes in the woods that were glowing. So glowing red eyes, she says. And, you know, Cappy and her friend, they go camping all the time. And so they know there could be predators and animals all over the place. And so they grab their flashlights and they shine in the direction of the eyes, and they kind of the eyes dart away and they don't think anything of it. Over the course of the night, the eyes would keep showing up all around them. And every time they'd shine a light in their direction, they would vanish. Cappy and her friend are unable to get the light on this thing. So they don't know what it is. And so they're very uneasy about it. But they decide, you know what? We're psyching ourselves out. It's just an animal that's interested in us. And so they go to bed and they sleep in their own. She slept in a tent and he slept in a camper. And they go to bed. And the next morning, Cappy wakes up and she's laying on the dirt outside of her tent. And immediately she has pain in the back of her neck. And so she reaches back and she grabs her neck and she can feel there's a cut on the back of her neck. She doesn't know what it is, and she looks up and her friend is on the ground outside of his camper face down as well. And so she gets up, she feels horrible, like sick, like violently sick in fact, and she kind of staggers away over to her friend who is laying there, and she can see too that he's got a mark on his neck, and he gets up and he's like, what happened? And they assumed that they had been bitten by, a poisonous spider. That's actually what they believed, because it was a little puncture wound on both of their necks, and that it had caused them to be sick and delirious. They'd wandered out of their camper and their tent, and they'd wound up on the ground. But now, as Cappy is retelling the story, she was like, I don't know how to connect that experience with what happened to the boy, but I can't help but feel like something weird's happening on Mount Shasta. And it would turn out that, maybe they weren't wrong, because Mount Shasta is like a hotspot for missing 411 strange disappearances. And in fact, our next story is another Mount Shasta case. In 1999, Carl Landers was a very experienced hiker, climber, whose passion in life was, on the weekends or any chance he got, was to go hiking and climbing and camping. That was just what he did. He was in great shape. He was enjoying retirement. That was his happy place, is being on a mountain somewhere in California, hiking around. And he had two very close friends that he would go hiking with just about every chance he could. In 1999, in the summer, Carl decides he wants to summit Mount Shasta. And it's something he had attempted to do before, and he had been unsuccessful, and this time he was going to do it. And so Mount Shasta, it's high enough, it's about 14,000 feet, that it's not uncommon for people to stop at this point called Lake Helen, where hikers can adjust to the altitude, because it's certainly possible to get sick from being at altitude if you don't adjust to it, or if your body doesn't respond well to it. And so their plan was get to Lake Helen, camp out for the night, and then summit the next day. So they head up in May of 1999, the three of them. They get to Lake Helen and they set up their camp for the night. It was clear that Carl already had some sort of altitude sickness, because by the time they reach Lake Helen, he's weak, he's sick, and he figures, I'm going to try to sleep it off tonight. I'll see how I feel in the morning. And so all night, Carl is just super sick. It's a horrible night for him. And so early the next morning, Carl, he's a real stubborn guy, and he really wanted to climb Mount Shasta. He says to his two friends, hey, look, I'm just going to get a head start here. I've been up basically all night. I'm going to just get up the last stretch here, summit this mountain, and then come back down and be done with it. And so his two friends, they didn't like the idea of splitting up, but Carl's an experienced guy. And I mean, he's only covering a distance of maybe 650 feet. Like, this is not some epic distance he's covering. It's basically like a day hike. So Carl leaves on his own. He leaves his backpack at the campsite, and his two friends would watch him as he kind of bent around the mountain and went up towards the summit, and that would be the last time they ever saw him. The two friends would attempt to summit as well about 30 minutes later. One of them apparently had gotten sick overnight and said, look, I can't do this, and he stays at the camp. He's like, I'll be here. We've already split up from Carl. Why don't you also go on your own, summit yourself, and I'll be here. I'll wait for Carl. I'll wait for you. The friend that does make the summit, he goes up. He follows the same trail, this short distance up to the summit, gets to the summit, and he hasn't seen Carl. He's not shocked. It is a little strange that they wouldn't have passed on the way, but he's thinking, anything could have happened. Maybe he sat down somewhere. I don't know what it is. And then comes back down expecting to see Carl back at the campsite. So he gets back to the campsite at Lake Helen, where the other sick friend had not left. He was still there. And he says, hey, has Carl come back? And the friend's like, no, didn't you see him on the way up? Did you lap him? Like, what's he doing up there? And he's like, no, I went up. I didn't see him on the way up. I didn't see him at the summit, and I didn't see him on the way down. And they're thinking to themselves, like, thinking about the trail itself. It's incredibly open. There's almost nowhere to like fall. There's no crevasse. There's no sheer cliff. You know, there's almost no vegetation really to obscure you. It just didn't make any sense that you could vanish. A huge search is launched. They never found anything. There was also 50 to 100 people in the area that day, and nobody knew where he went. No one saw him. No one had any idea what happened to him. They interviewed everybody there. No one knows what happened to Carl. The only clue that we have of Carl is the backpack that he left at Lake Helen before he made the summit run. Other than that, for 20 years, we have no clue what happened to him. None. So this next story is really creepy. One of the strange phenomenons that you get inside of these missing 411 stories is you have people that go missing really suddenly, like as if they were pulled away at high speed and just ripped off the face of the mountain. And this story is one of those stories. In 2010, Eric Lewis was 57 years old. He was an extremely experienced mountain climber, and he had two very close friends that were also very experienced mountain climbers. And they decided that they wanted to go hike Mount Rainier in Washington State, which is a huge mountain. And they were doing a climb that was fairly technical and fairly dangerous, and it required the three of them to be tethered together on the same cable. And so as they're making this ascent of Mount Rainier, you have friend one in the front, friend two in the middle, and then Eric Lewis is the third guy on the line all the way down. And so the way it worked is the first climber, friend number one, if he wanted to rest, the other two climbers would keep climbing up to his position and take a rest with him. So he was kind of in charge of setting the cadence of how quickly they were going to climb this mountain. And so over the course of the day, the first climber would stop periodically, and then the second climber and Eric would make their way up and wait and relax. All day that was happening. And then one time they come to a stop, and there's been nothing weird happening. Nothing's happened to this point. Everything feels very normal. The first guy stops, the second climber gets up to him, and then Eric doesn't show up. And so they pull on the line, and it's very light. And they pull it up, and the rope has been cut. Like, Eric's gone. And they're like, okay, only in an emergency would you cut the line. And so they just start immediately descending because they're like, well, it just snowed. It'll be very easy to track his footsteps. If he cut the line, he must have had a reason. Let's follow his footsteps to wherever he went. But the only footsteps on the mountain were the ones walking up, attached to the rope. Basically, Eric had been walking up, leaving footprints right behind the other two, and then the footprints just stop. There aren't footprints that go back down. It was like he was pulled off of the mountain. And so they start walking down thinking they're going to run into him, but they don't. The weather gets bad enough that they ultimately abandon the hike. They go down and they're like, geez. They tell the authorities and they're looking everywhere and they can't find him. And then they discover this creepy cave that's like 200 feet down and away from where they were hiking. That would have been very hard to get to. Inside of this ice cave is Eric's gear, but no Eric. And they've never found Eric's body. But for that gear to get into the cave, it wasn't just, hanging on the edge. It was inside the cave. But there was no footprints leading to the cave. There was no footprints anywhere. It was just like inexplicably, Eric's gear winds up deep inside an ice cave 200 feet away, and Eric's body was never recovered, and no one has any idea what happened to him. So the last story is actually really two distinct stories, but they together make up a particular phenomenon that occurs inside some of these missing 411 cases, and that's when some creature takes a child and actually protects them. In 1868, a 3-year-old girl vanished abruptly from her father's camp in northern Michigan. The father noticed the girl was gone. In hysterics, he enlists the help of a couple professional hunters that were there with him. They go off looking for this girl, and after a couple of hours of looking, they start to hear what sounds like her voice. And she doesn't sound particularly distraught, but it's definitely a child's voice. And so they kind of cut through this big thicket, and out bursts this massive bear-looking thing that runs away from them. And they didn't shoot it or anything. They just saw this huge animal run away, and they're thinking the worst because they're hearing this child, and now they're seeing this huge animal that looks like a bear running away. And they go through the thicket and they find this girl who's totally unharmed, who was in this kind of clearing within the thicket where clearly this bear creature had been with her. And the father's elated. He scoops up the child, and the child seems unhurt, and he asks her, like, where have you been? What happened? And she says, oh, Mr. Wolf took me here. And Mr. Wolf was feeding me berries, and Mr. Wolf was playing with me. Maybe it was a bear or a wolf or something, but some animal had taken her, brought her into a thicket, and had not harmed her. And so the other instance occurred in 1955 when a family that was made up of mother, father, and their 8 kids were staying in this camp in Montana. And they had all these different tents set up for all their kids. And some of the older kids were staying in one of the tents with their 2-year-old sister, Ida Mae, while the parents were working and the kids were doing whatever they were doing. And so these older kids are sitting deep inside the tent, and near the entrance to the tent is where Ida Mae, the 2-year-old, is sitting. And the tent is open, like the flap is open to the tent. And as they're sitting there, the older kids would later say that a bear wandered past, reached in, grabbed Ida Mae, and scooped her up into its arm. Now, a bear does not do this with its arm, but they described it like this. The bear was holding Ida like this and ran away on 3 legs instead of 4. And so the kids are freaked out because they just saw a bear take their 2-year-old away. They're basically hysterical. They sprint up to their mom and dad. They tell them what happened. And the parents just have no idea how to react to this. They obviously get in touch with authorities. They launch the search. And as they're doing the search, police are asking the kids, like, describe to us again what you saw. And they're like, it was a bear that was like holding our sister like this. And they were like, you got to be more descriptive because bears can't do that. Was it a person? Was it a hairy person? And the police just didn't buy that it was a bear. And so 2 days go by and they haven't found this child. And so the family obviously is thinking the worst. They're absolutely grief-stricken. And then one of the searchers finds the girl. And they find her about 300 yards away from the camp. She was inside of a very intentionally built structure. It was like a crudely built fort. Right against the riverbed. And inside it was like a den, and she was in there and she was totally unharmed and she was perfectly fine. And they take her out and they ask her, like, what happened? And she's 2, but she says, Mr. Bear fed me berries. Mr. Bear kept me here. Mr. Bear cuddled me. That's all we have. We don't know what this creature was, what bear is able to pull its arm in like this, but she felt totally unthreatened by it. And to this day, we don't really know if that was a bear or something else, but whatever it was, it didn't harm Ida, and Ida never felt threatened by it. These stories are just a fraction of the literal thousands of strange cases that David Paulides covers in his Missing 411 project. So if you enjoyed this video and you might want to see more content just like this, I would encourage you to gently uppercut the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't.
Around lunchtime on August 25th, 2012, a young woman named Grace was standing in a public restroom in front of the mirror in southern Iceland applying makeup. Someone knocked on the door, and Grace quickly shouted an apology, but then made no move to finish up. Grace was in the middle of a solo bus trip across Iceland, and she was feeling kind of gross from all the travel. Every day around noon, the tour bus she was on would make a pit stop for lunch at whatever touristy location was nearby. And today, they were at Eldkau, which is the largest volcanic canyon in the world. Now, usually, Grace would use these pit stops not just to get lunch, but also to walk around and see the sights. But today, she was using this break just to freshen up. So Grace finished putting on her eyeliner and put her hair up in a high ponytail, and then she changed her shirt, stuffing her old one back into her backpack. Then she stepped out of the bathroom into a large parking lot, and she saw her tour bus on the other side, and she saw other tour members making their way on board. Grace hustled across the lot, got onto the bus, and settled back into her seat. Only a few minutes later, the driver stood up and announced to the bus that it was time to leave. But before they left, he did what he did at every single stop. He did a head count, just to make sure nobody got left behind. Now, typically, Grace did not pay much attention to the driver when he did this head count. It was a very administrative thing. She would just sit there looking out the window waiting for the bus to start. But on this day, at some point, as Grace was sitting there, she realized the head count was taking a really long time. And when she noticed that, she looked up at the driver, and he looked visibly upset. And he was clearly doing the head count over and over again, like he was really trying to make sure he was doing it right. And then finally, the driver just announced to Grace and all the other people on the bus that they couldn't go anywhere because somebody from their tour group was missing. Now, the first thing they did is they just sat there and waited for about an hour, just hoping that this missing person would turn up. But when they didn't, the driver called the police. So this area, Eldkau, is a sprawling canyon that was formed more than 1,000 years earlier during a volcanic eruption. The canyon itself is very deep, and it has steep walls on either side, and at the bottom is all this volcanic debris. So it's beautiful to look at, but it's pretty difficult to navigate. And so if somebody was exploring this area on their own and somehow got lost in the process, this could become a very dangerous place for them very quickly. So when the bus driver called the police to report a missing tour group member in this particular area, the police immediately sent out a search and rescue party. And when they arrived, the first thing they did was interview the remaining tour group members to try to figure out who the missing person actually was, because it wasn't clear yet. Pretty quickly, some of the tour group members recalled seeing this young woman of Asian descent who was wearing dark clothes and was carrying a light-colored bag, who had left the bus at the beginning of lunch and had not returned. Now, Grace had not personally seen this young woman, and she told police as much when she was interviewed, but she, like basically everybody else on the tour, immediately volunteered to help with the search. So, for the entire rest of the day, that is what Grace and the others all did. They searched for this missing person. Grace was teamed up with another member of the tour, as well as a trained rescuer, and they walked out into the canyon, searching along a grid pattern with the rest of the team. After a few hours with no luck, officials sent in more rescuers and a helicopter. And by the time the night fell, the entire canyon was lit up by searchlights, and you could barely hear anything over the sound of the helicopter making repeated passes overhead. But despite this enormous effort, there still was no sign of the missing tourist. Finally, at around 3 a.m., Grace broke off from the search and returned to the bus to get some sleep. But before settling into her seat, Grace opened up her backpack to pull out some makeup wipes, and as she did that, something inside of her bag caught her eye. And when she saw it, she froze. She stared at this object, and as she did, she felt herself break out in a cold sweat, because suddenly she knew exactly where this missing woman was. It would turn out that over the course of the previous day, the people on board the bus made a series of small mistakes, but together they snowballed and turned into one huge mistake. First, the bus driver had made a mistake with his head count. Not the head count he had done that afternoon, but the one he had done earlier that day, before they drove to Eldkau. That morning, he had accidentally counted one too many people on board the bus and not realized it. Then, that afternoon, when he had counted again and actually had the right number of people on board, he thought there was a missing person. Next, the description of the woman who had gotten off the bus and didn't come back, the so-called missing person, that description had only been half correct. So yes, there had been a young woman of Asian descent wearing a dark sweatshirt, carrying a light-colored bag. She had gotten off the bus, but she did get back on. Except that when she did, she looked different, and so nobody recognized her. And this was because this woman had gotten off the bus to go to the restroom to freshen up. She had put on makeup, she had put her hair up in a ponytail, and she had taken off her dark-colored sweatshirt. The object that Grace found in her backpack that made her realize that she knew exactly where this missing woman was her dark-colored sweatshirt inside of her light-colored backpack. And it was at that exact moment that Grace knew. The person that she had spent the last 15 hours searching for was herself. Before dawn on December 12, 1992, a 17-year-old girl named Tracy Dion sat in the passenger seat of a little two-door car that was swerving down a deserted road in the Yankton Sioux Reservation in South Dakota. Everybody in the car was drunk, including Tracy. Sitting next to Tracy in the middle front seat was her 19-year-old cousin named Ruby, and Ruby's boyfriend, a 20-year-old named Arnold, was driving the car. All three of them had been out partying all night, and so now they were trying to make it home. The swerving was making Tracy feel sick to her stomach, but she didn't want to say anything to Arnold in fear that she might distract him. I mean, it was really dark outside, there was no streetlights, there was ice on the road. I mean, for a sober driver, this would be a challenging drive, let alone a drunk driver. They were coming up on an intersection, and Arnold brought the car to a stop with a lurch. Tracy watched as Arnold checked for cross traffic and then pulled out onto Highway 281. But halfway through this turn, as Arnold was accelerating, Tracy began to feel the car slide. And even in her drunken state, she could tell Arnold had hit a patch of black ice. And so as the car began to skid, she wanted to scream, but before she could, the car was already flipping over, and then everything went black. A short time later, Tracy came to. The car was upside down, and Tracy quickly realized she had fallen out of her seat and was now basically resting on the roof of the car, which was now on the ground. From what she could tell, after the car had finished rolling over, it had come to a stop just off the side of the highway, and so they were not in immediate danger from other cars striking them. But she couldn't really see outside because the windows were so badly cracked. Beside her, Tracy could hear her cousin, Ruby, pounding on the driver's side door trying to get it to open, and so Tracy tried to look around Ruby to see Arnold, to see if he was okay, but when she did, she saw the driver's seat was empty. Tracy tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The driver's side door was closed, but Arnold was gone. Just then, Tracy heard the sound of the driver's side door opening, and she turned to see her cousin Ruby forcing the door open just a few inches, and then a second later, Ruby was slithering out through that crack to the outside. To Tracy, everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. She was too shocked and confused to make any sense of it. But if Ruby was getting out of the car, Tracy felt like she should too. And so Tracy turned and crawled across to the driver's side and was about to make an exit the same way Ruby had when the door slammed shut violently right in Tracy's face. Tracy didn't understand why Ruby would do something like that. Why would she shut the door that aggressively when she knew her cousin was still inside? Tracy tried to open the door again, but she was too weak to do it. She figured her cousin Ruby was okay, but she couldn't see outside because of how cracked the windows were. At this point, Tracy began to feel woozy. She laid her head down on the roof of the car, wondering to herself why Ruby and Arnold had left her behind. Tracy would stay trapped inside of the car, alone, for a few hours, until finally a motorist saw the flipped-over car and called 911. Shortly after that, first responders arrived on the scene, they pulled Tracy out of the car, and shockingly, she actually didn't have really any serious injuries at all. She didn't even need to be hospitalized. But rescuers could not find Ruby or Arnold anywhere. They were gone. And once rescuers had scoured the entire area around the crash site, the sheriff who was in charge of the scene started to wonder if Arnold and Ruby were not just missing. Maybe, he thought, they had fled. Arnold had been driving drunk, and all three of them were underage, and so the sheriff thought maybe Arnold and Ruby were scared to get in trouble. Over the next few days, the police continued to search the surrounding area for Arnold and Ruby, hoping they were not badly injured and that they would just turn up on their own, but they never did. And as the days turned into weeks, hope began to wane for the young couple. Their family and friends kept searching the area along 281 where the car had flipped, looking for any clue as to where these two had gone. But there was nothing. There was no trace of them. It was like Arnold and Ruby had gotten out of the car and just vanished. But in January of 1993, so 3 weeks after the crash, strange and conflicting reports of sightings began to trickle in. First, a woman came forward claiming to have seen Arnold, alive and well, at a New Year's Eve party. Now, the police doubted this claim, but this woman was insistent that she had seen Arnold, and they actually hooked her up to a lie detector test, and she passed the test. And so officials brought in guests from this party who this woman claimed were with Arnold, and they asked them, "Were you with Arnold?" And they said no, but they failed their lie detector tests. Now, of course, this was suspicious, but police really didn't know what to do with this information. Assuming this woman's story was true, that she really did see Arnold, well, according to the details of her story, Arnold did not appear to be in any kind of distress. And even if he was in distress, the police still had no idea where he was, so how could they help him? Other locals came forward, claiming to have spotted Arnold around town as well. But nothing came of those reports either. Neither Arnold nor Ruby turned up. Months went by, and the case went cold. Until March 10th, when a driver was going down Highway 281, and they noticed a strange object in the drainage ditch next to the road. By now, the weather was much warmer than it had been on the day of the crash. So instead of snow and ice inside of this drainage ditch, it was runoff water. And the strange object was floating in it. The driver stopped his car, got out, and walked up to see what this thing was, and as soon as he saw it, he turned, ran back to his car, and called the police. Because what the driver had just found was a dead body. And when the police arrived and searched the area, they found another body not far away. The bodies belonged to Ruby and Arnold. But this discovery did not solve the mystery of what happened to Ruby and Arnold. Instead, it made it much more bizarre. Because first of all, the bodies were found 75 feet away from the original crash site. And the exact spots where the two bodies were found had been searched many, many times on the day of the crash, days after the crash. They were searched by police, they were searched by friends and family of Ruby and Arnold. The idea that this is where the bodies had been the whole time was impossible. They would have been found. And then there was the condition of the bodies. Ruby's body was extremely decomposed, which made sense given the fact that the crash was 3 months earlier. But Arnold's body was barely decomposed at all. And in the pocket of Arnold's jeans, police found a mysterious set of 3 keys. 1 was a vehicle key and 2 were house keys. But none of them opened any vehicle or building that Arnold was known to frequent, and nobody recognized them. Finally, the police found a tuft of hair lying near where the bodies had been found. It was Ruby's hair, but it didn't look like the hair had been there for very long, certainly not 3 months. Instead of being dirty and matted, like you would expect given how long she must have been there, the hair was perfectly clean. The official coroner's report on Ruby and Arnold's deaths were that they died of exposure, and then their bodies were just overlooked by searchers for months. But to a lot of people, including the sheriff who was in charge of the original crash site, this made no sense. Despite the coroner's findings, law enforcement officials believed that Ruby and Arnold's deaths were the result of foul play. Under the foul play theory, somebody pulled Ruby and Arnold out of the crash site while they were still alive and then killed them later. And then perhaps they killed them at different times, which would account for the differences in decomposition of their bodies. The FBI ultimately came in and took over this case, but they eventually closed it down, citing a lack of evidence to support the foul play theory. However, with or without foul play being involved here, nobody has a good explanation for all those sightings of Arnold after the crash. And also, nobody can explain why the door was slammed in Tracy's face in the immediate aftermath of the crash. Maybe it was Ruby or Arnold who slammed the door, or maybe it was their killer. To this day, what actually happened on December 12, 1992, on the side of Highway 281 remains a mystery. In December of 2014, a 24-year-old man named Aaron Frazier sat in the driver's seat of an excavator in the backyard of his childhood home in Jacksonville, Florida. He pushed a lever forward, and he watched as the metal bucket dipped down and cut into this big slab of concrete, and debris went flying everywhere, and Aaron loved it. He smiled with satisfaction watching this destruction taking place, and he pressed the lever again and ripped off another piece of concrete. Today, Aaron was ripping out the backyard swimming pool of his old home, a home which his father had recently given him the deed to. But this property was not a nostalgic place for Aaron. In fact, he hadn't lived here since he was 3 years old, and the handful of memories he had from being in this place were basically all bad. His parents fought all the time, and then one day in 1993, his mom just decided to leave, and then after she was gone, his dad wasn't able to care for him, and so before long, Aaron was shipped off to foster care. So now he was kind of enjoying demolishing the property. He had some big renovations planned, starting with the backyard. By early afternoon, the pool was all gone, and so Aaron swung his bucket over to the outdoor shower that was located next to where the pool had been, and he dug the bucket into the concrete, and as soon as he did, immediately this geyser of water shot into the sky, and so Aaron knew he must have hit a water line. And so Aaron jumped out of the excavator, he turned off the water, and then he grabbed a shovel and headed over to the outdoor shower to inspect the damage. He basically needed to dig where the excavator bucket had just begun digging to see what exactly had been struck. And so with the shovel, he starts kind of moving away the mud and concrete, And at some point, the head of his shovel, the blade, it hit something sort of rigid and plastic. And he moved the shovel out of the way and he looked, and at first it looked like a plastic bag, but it was too rigid to be a plastic bag. And so he took a shovel and kind of moved the dirt out of the way, and he saw it was definitely not a plastic bag. It was thick plastic sheeting like you would use in major construction projects. Curious why the sheeting would be underneath this outdoor shower, Aaron used a shovel and basically pierced the plastic sheeting, and then he got down and peeled away the plastic with his bare hands. And as he did that, he began to notice that the sheeting was wrapped tightly around some sort of bulky object. And so he's pulling it away, and finally he reveals the object, and it's this old coconut. And so he actually reached down and pulled the coconut out and just stared at it, like, why is this under here? Aaron was really confused by this. Like, why would somebody take the time to wrap a coconut in waterproof industrial sheeting and then bury it? And so as Aaron just sort of stood there wondering what this could be, he began rotating this coconut around in his hands. And when he saw the back of this coconut, he screamed. It would turn out Aaron's mother did not just suddenly abandon the family. On the night of January 6th, 1993, the day that she vanished, well, Aaron's mom and father got into this huge fight and got out of hand, and Aaron's father shot and killed Aaron's mother with a .22 caliber rifle. Aaron's father then staged the murder to look like Aaron's mother simply stormed out and never looked back. Now, when the police investigated her absence, they did not believe Aaron's father's story. They thought there was something off about it, but there wasn't enough hard evidence to actually connect him to the crime, and so nobody ever caught him. But that all changed in 2014 when a court ordered that the deed of Aaron's childhood home be transferred from his father to him. The coconut that Aaron found in the backyard of his home was his mother's skull. He just didn't realize it until he rotated it